Thomas Hughes was an English lawyer and author born in 1822 in what's now Oxfordshire in England. In 1857, he wrote a novel called Tom Brown's School Days, which was about an English schoolboy attending the rugby school. He went on to become a judge in July 1882 and was elected to the British Parliament. One of his daughters was a passenger on the Titanic and died when that ship sank after hitting an iceberg in 1912. He passed away in 1896 in Brighton, England. Well, that's interesting, you might be saying, but what does this guy have to do with Appalachia? That, podcast listeners, is our story today. Hello, folks. I'm Steve Gilly, along with Rod Mullins, and this is Stories, a History of Appalachia. Be sure, if you don't mind, to go down and subscribe to our little YouTube channel. And if you don't care, give us a thumbs up too, okay?
Well, Steve, you've piqued my interest on this. And when you started talking about the Titanic, that kind of got my attention a little bit more because, you know, I'm kind of one of those buffs. I like to follow the Titanic and, you know, the things about it and the stories. But, yeah, where does this all come into with Appalachia and who we're talking about here? Thomas Hughes, is that who we're talking about? Well, where does he come into Appalachia?
Well, we're going to tell you right now. Thomas Hughes' book, Tom Brown's School Days, wasn't just about a story about a boy in school. It was also a way for Hughes to write about and promote what was known at the time as Christian socialism. And by that, he meant the cooperative ownership of community business as opposed to the full-throated dog-eat-dog capitalism that was prevalent in Victorian England at the time, tempered by principles of Christianity, mainly kindness and looking out for others. He was also concerned about the after effects of feudalism, in which the eldest son in England inherited all of his father's estate, and the other children got nothing and had to go out and kind of scrape and make their own way in the world. So, after the success of his book, Thomas Hughes hatched another plan, a utopia where the lesser sons and daughters of England would have a chance to own land and make a good life for themselves and be free of the social and moral ills of Victorian England. And where best to do that than in the land of opportunity that was America?
Well, in 1870, Hughes made a trip to America to meet a friend of his, poet James Russell Lowe. Now, through him, he learned of the Board of Aid to Land Ownership, an organization based in Boston, Massachusetts, that helped urbanites suffering from economic depression in the city to relocate to rural areas, taking their skills with them to build new towns and also to build new lives. Hughes kept a mental note of what he had learned in Boston. Well, in 1878, the Board of Aid president, Franklin Smith, and an agent for the Southern Railway, Cyrus Clark, were taking a trip on the railway's new line across the Cumberland Plateau, and well, they were impressed with the clean air, forests, and the scenic vistas. Through their Knoxville, Tennessee attorney, Oliver Perry Temple, they began to buy land in the Tennessee hills north of Knoxville in Morgan and Scott counties.
Now, Smith had originally planned to move families from Boston to Tennessee to start over, but the economy had proved so much that, well, there was little interest. He then thought of his meeting with Thomas Hughes and contacted him to see if he might have an interest in the land, which he did. Hughes formed a partnership with two British lawyers, and, Rod, instead of buying the land, they simply bought the Board of Aid, keeping Franklin Smith on board to set up a colony in the Tennessee hills. Smith chose the site for the new colony, and there, in 1880, the Board of Aid founded the Rugby Colony, named, well, not after the closest thing the English have to American football, but rather after that school that Tom Brown attended in that novel written by Thomas Hughes. By 1884, the Rugby Colony had over 400 residents, a tennis team, a social club, a literary society, and 65 buildings and houses. They also had a 3-story hotel named the Tavern End, which got its name from the Canterbury Tales.
What a unique name for a hotel, the Tavern End. Yeah, I just got finished teaching that a little bit to some of my students, and they looked at me like they had no idea what I was talking about when it came to the Canterbury Tales. Anyway, on October 5th, 1880, with Thomas Hughes in attendance, rugby was opened all colonists were required to invest $5 in the commissary, giving them all common ownership in it. Well, the New York Times and Harper's Weekly, along with English newspapers, all covered Rugby's progress. All was perfect. Well, not quite. Because you see, the land was gotten at a pretty good price. The reason for that was that the soil on the land was not the best soil in the world to have large farms or grow large amounts of food. It was thin, poor, more suited for grazing than for growing crops.
And the other reason things didn't proceed as Hughes hoped were the colonists themselves. Now, most of them had come from English upper-class families, the gentry, if you will. And these folks, well, they really weren't used to doing the very hard work it would take to scratch a living out of that Tennessee red clay soil. For example, in 1883, the colony built a fine tomato canning operation, probably one of the best in the entire country. The next year, the colonists didn't grow enough tomatoes to keep that cannery running, so it fell into disrepair. Oh, and then there were the lawsuits. You see, the Board of Aid bought the land, but apparently they didn't make sure that the folks that they bought it from had good title. Rugby was plagued with lawsuits by locals who claimed title to the land, all of which had to be defended in court by lawyers, all of whom had to be paid to do that defending. And on top of all this, Rod, in 1881, there was an outbreak of typhoid fever at about this time, which ended up killing a number of the English colonists and causing the closing of the Tavern End.
Wow. All of this thinking it was a utopia and it was turning into a dystopia right before their eyes. Wow. Mm-hmm. Well, it all sounds vaguely like what happened at Jamestown 250 years earlier, minus troubles with the Native Americans. But by 1890, the dream had faded away and most of the colonists had left to return to Victorian England. But here's the thing. Rugby remains to this day. There you can find a collection of Victorian buildings, all taken care of, an Episcopal church, a schoolhouse, a library, a commissary, and several homes, all still standing. Now, the Christ Church Episcopal Church has met regularly there, if I can say that word, since 1887, and has a reed organ that dates back to 1849, which makes that organ the oldest in America. The Thomas Hughes Library has a collection of 7,000 volumes donated by a Boston bookseller on the condition they name the new library for Hughes. The oldest book in that collection dates back to, get this, Steve, 1687.
Well, Rugby, like Rod said, is still there. It's lovingly maintained by preservationists who formed Historic Rugby in 1966. In 1972, Rugby was listed as a historic district under the name Rugby Colony on the National Register of Historic Places. And you can visit Rugby yourself if you've a mind to and see all those old Victorian buildings.
Well, a lot of these things they intended, they had big dreams. They had bright ideas about making things like this happen. And, it's kind of like a lot of these stories and novels and so forth about, like I mentioned, everybody sets out to create the perfect utopia where they don't have to do a thing, but usually those utopias kind of fall into disarray and become dystopian societies before it's all over with.
Yeah, that's happened time and time again, and I'm sure as time goes by, it'll happen many more times.
Yes, it will.
And folks, that's the story of the Rugby Colony. Another bit of the history of this place we call home, Appalachia. Thanks for listening. Now, if you're watching us on YouTube, be sure to click that subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. You can also subscribe to the audio version of the Stories podcast at Apple Podcasts, Audible, Amazon Music, Spotify, Radio Public, iHeartRadio, Odyssey, or on your favorite podcast app. Oh, we're on Facebook, too, at Stories of Appalachia, on Twitter at Story Appalachia, and on Instagram, also at Story Appalachia. Be sure to follow us for more stories of Appalachian history. Till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.
So long.